Welcome to The Jury's Still Out, a show highlighting and discussing all things having to do with law, trials, and juries. Your host is Mary Griffiths, a litigation consulting expert who has overseen thousands of cases in state and federal courts, and is a jury correspondent to discuss trial matters and media strategy as it pertains to jury selection and courtroom performance. This is The Jury's Still Out.
Hi, welcome back to The Jury's Still Out, where we talk about everything law, trials, jury, and storytelling. Today, we're going to focus on healthcare law, something that I know is on a lot of people's minds as we come out of this pandemic. I'm very excited to talk with my next guest who's been practicing in this area for a long, long time. He's done some medical malpractice work on the defense side for both doctors and nurses, hospitals, and also assisted living centers and nursing homes. Please welcome to the show, Frank Alvarez.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely.
And thank you for saying long, long time instead of the number of years, because that makes me feel really old when I think about the number of years.
You and I are in the freaking same boat, so you know I wouldn't just throw you out there by yourself, you know. Right. So what got you, Frank? I mean, there's so many different types of law that you can practice. What brought you into healthcare law?
So, it's funny. A lot of folks, when you ask them why they went to law school, they say, well, because I didn't know what else to do when I graduated from college. But I started thinking about it when I was younger. My dad was a lawyer. Mm-hmm. I've defended healthcare providers for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. And he actually has been a plaintiff's lawyer his entire career. And as part of that practice, has sued healthcare providers. And so when I was younger, I spent a lot of time in his office and obviously talking to him and hearing about cases, and I just thought it was really interesting. And actually, at that point, I thought about maybe medical school or something when I was, in my late teens. And then but before that, even I took a class in high school called Law Major Studies, and had a great teacher. Did a really good job of making the law interesting and
so important.
Pieces of the law interesting. And so as part of that, there was a practical part where we got to go and watch 3 times a week a jury trial that was going on in Collin County. We would just go drive ourselves up there and walk into a courtroom and find a jury trial that's going on. Right. And got to see a lot of things firsthand, voir dire and arguing emotions and watching the judge and juries. And it was just, it was fascinating and interesting. So that really is what started piquing my interest, and then graduated and decided, I'm going to pull the trigger and go to law school. So I did.
Well, what made you, that's a great life experience that you had with your dad being a plaintiff's lawyer. I think it's always really wonderful when lawyers get to see sort of the other side on things. Sure. So you went the defense path. What made you go that way instead of maybe going into plaintiff's law, doing healthcare law? Good
question. So the first 2 years out of school, my last 2 years of law school and my first year out of law school, I worked at a plaintiff's firm in San Antonio, where I went to law school and had a great experience. Still consider those people great friends. They're very good lawyers and had a great experience, as I said. And I decided, I want to move back to Dallas. I grew up here, still had a ton of friends here, and wanted to move back up this way. So I decided to start looking around, and actually a couple of folks who were mutual friends of ours were at a firm at the time that they happened to be doing healthcare defense. And I thought, you know what? I'm very familiar with healthcare law. I thought about going to medical school at one time. Always, I thought I could probably have a little bit of a passion for that because I'll be defending providers. And so I thought, I'm going to do it. And so that's what got me to the defense side. And I've been doing healthcare defense ever since.
That's very cool, because you already kind of had this sort of not yearning, but a pull to maybe go to medical school. And so now you're doing things that involve a lot of medical knowledge. Right. So here we are. It's kind of like end of May 2020, and we're coming out of this pandemic, and I know that we're all sort of excited to be coming out of our houses and kind of venturing out and doing all of these things. But for this particular industry, for this particular type of law, I am sure it's gangbusters now for you guys as far as busyness. Yeah. So what are the type of questions that you're getting from your clients, whether nursing homes, doctors, hospitals? What's a trend?
Yeah, I mean, the primary trend in the moment is from the facilities themselves and from providers themselves is, hey, what do I do? I just had a patient test positive. What do I do? I just had a resident test positive. What do I do? I just had a family member who was visiting their grandmother, but they were in the facility to see somebody. The grandmother's friend tested positive. What do I do? I mean, people are nervous. People are not sure exactly how to respond and how to handle things. So I think they're over-reporting. So I'm to buildings and things. So I'm getting a lot of questions about what do I do. I obviously direct folks to what Clay Jenkins, the local county judge in Dallas County, has said about what is mandated as it relates to that. If you have somebody in a facility that's tested positive, same if Governor Abbott has issued any particular order. But there's also kind of the common sense approach, and from my perspective, the litigation approach. All right, what are we going to do? One, from a litigation standpoint, a little forward thinking on, okay, what are we going to do to make sure that we're guarding against any future litigation to the extent we can, and more importantly, what are we helping these folks do to do right by the residents that are there now, and forgetting about the litigation part. Let's keep as many people safe as we can, recognizing that this is unprecedented and unknown, and we're doing the best we can. Let's do X, Y, and Z. It may not be a perfect solution, but it's the best solution based on what we know at the time. So it's, it really, it's many things, but it all kind of starts with, this has happened. What do I do?
What do I do
now? Yeah.
Do you have a lot of questions regarding like access? Are people questioning, like you said about family members, can I come in and see them? Or, what's the latest time duration where I'm going to be able to kind of resume a normal, maybe seeing somebody in a hospital or seeing somebody in a nursing care facility? I mean, is that one of the topics?
That is, and it is a lot of our clients who are bigger, in terms of they have more buildings, they have a pretty good protocol in place. They might bounce ideas off of us.
Sure.
And they stick by it pretty strictly in terms of who can come in. I mean, I've heard stories about, this particular resident has 5 children.
Right.
Unfortunately, only one of them can go in the building.
Right. Wow.
And that's a difficult decision to have to make, and I wouldn't want to have to do it. But to keep all of the residents safe, they have to do that. Some of the smaller mom and pop shops, though, that are the 1-2 facility type owners, they haven't dealt with these types of things before on any level, and so we get a lot more calls from them. And what we typically tell them is, we'll talk through what's the makeup of the facility, structurally. Do you have wings? Is it everybody in one spot? Can you isolate? Can you do certain things to keep residents and family members and others from being in that area? That's really how we handle it. It's kind of it depends on many factors. Primarily, from my perspective, it's the structural part of it. How are you going to, if your facility does not allow for you to put people in a certain place in the building so that they're isolated, how are you going to deal with that?
Right. How are you going to deal with it?
You have to be more strict in that sense, I think. Nobody's allowed,
Do you see there's going to be a particular uptake in a certain part of healthcare law? I mean, if your answer is, like we're just dealing with what can we do now?
Yeah.
If you had your crystal ball, what do you think is going to be happening, in the next sort of year?
So, and I think the year is probably a kind of a magic number. The statute of limitations in Texas is for healthcare claim is 2 years,
right?
Plus 75 days if they give notice,
right?
Within that 2 years. So, but 2 years generally speaking. So we know that if we're going to see litigation, it'll be roughly before the spring of 2022.
Yeah.
I think a lot of lawyers, a lot of good lawyers, good plaintiffs lawyers are kind of taking a wait and see approach.
Right.
I think that there are going to be causation problems and standard of care problems, and that they're going to be facing among just the general feeling about healthcare workers right now too. But what I expect to see is an uptick in terms of litigation, COVID litigation.
Right.
I do think there will be a multitude of lawsuits filed, for failure to have proper infection control policies.
Right.
Failure to have PPE, failure to isolate properly. I mean, there's a multitude of reasons people could sue, despite the fact that there might be a causation problem.
Right.
So what I do expect to see, though, is potentially a little bit of a downtick for a few months, maybe this latter half of this year, in healthcare cases, because people aren't being treated as much for other reasons right now, right? We read that, there's 60% less calls for heart attack victims, to houses and things. It's just people aren't wanting to go to get treated right now, or they're not permitted to, and so there has not been as much treatment. So I think there might be a downtick there, but there will be an uptick in COVID litigation. Right. There's a myriad of insurance-related issues and things that'll come into play too, about whether those claims are covered or not, and so.
Right. Well, and one of the things that I know I'd love to talk to you about later is kind of like the virtual juries and all of that. But teleport medicine, have you had any sort of, since you were just saying that nobody's kind of like being treated for other stuff maybe right now with COVID, has there been any claims about the telemedicine so far?
Not that I've seen more than normal.
Right.
I guess there could be. I think it might be difficult given that you had no other alternative.
Right.
And the doctors are good about saying, look, we're going to have to do this. You don't have to do it this way. In fact, I can speak from personal experience. I was scheduled to have a doctor appointment during that time period. The doctor reached out, said, would you rather do it in person and wait? I said, sure, let's just wait.
Yeah.
So I do think that, I think that they've probably covered themselves sufficiently via waivers and things. But that's an interesting thought, yeah.
So do you have like a particular idea about, because I know you and your practice and everything like that, have you seen, what do you think that jurors have a hard time understanding when it comes to healthcare law? Like, let's take assisted living centers or nursing homes. Do you think that is there a stumbling block sometimes that you see jurors take for cases involving those type of facilities?
I think generally speaking in healthcare, the stumbling block is causation. And what I mean by that is, you've got a treatment that was given and an outcome, and there could be a myriad of reasons why that happened. Some obvious, some not. And the explanation for it is sometimes very confusing and difficult to understand for doctors, much less for people like me and jurors. So I think that is the most difficult part for them. The in a long-term care case specifically, it's the most difficult part, in addition to causation, is for me is appreciating how hard the people work inside those buildings. Right. There's this notion that nursing homes, folks just go to nursing homes and they're not cared for. That's not the case at all. I mean, I'm sure there are one-off situations which can happen anywhere in any line of business. But as a general rule, I find that these people try really hard to do a really good job, and they chose this profession because they want to help people. And I think it's hard for jurors to see that, because the outcomes, you've got this elderly population who can't help themselves, and the outcomes are usually 90% of the time death. Right. For some reason. Right. It may not have been any reason or fault of the care provider. Right. But there was a death, and so it's hard for jurors to appreciate they worked really hard, but these people died anyway. Right, because they start out from the juror's standpoint, a very sympathetic plaintiff, somebody's elderly, in a victim type state that they can't help themselves. Correct. And then you're absolutely right. There's a lot of
perspective that the jurors need to understand when looking at assisted living centers. They have to follow a lot of protocols. They have to review a lot of things. That is sort of the hurdle that they need to get over, is it not just, were they just ticking boxes, or were they really kind of caring for that individual?
Right.
And I think COVID especially is going to kind of bring that, not only how much they have to do, but the caring that's involved when they're taking care of these, the older folks.
Yeah, I agree with you. COVID's going to present the causation piece, is to go back to that. As it relates to COVID, is going to be incredibly difficult for them to. Was this person going to pass anyway as a result of their underlying condition? Did they get COVID because of something that somebody did wrong in the facility? Did they get COVID because, as we talked about, Johnny's girlfriend's grandmother's sister was in the building and had it? It's given the incubation period involving, with COVID, it's going to be difficult from a causation standpoint. And jurors are going to have really an unfair, they're going to be in an unfair position trying to decide whether it was somebody died because of COVID or whether somebody died for some other reason.
Well, and unlike,
or negligence anyway.
Yeah, a negligence issue or something like that. But unlike other times, in the past, we've never dealt with like a pandemic like this. So it's going to be interesting to see how jurors are going to take the newness of this, the how would anyone have been prepared for this? So that factor.
So that's one of the defenses, right? I mean, in medicine, you don't practice with a retrospective scope, as we've talked about before, and so in hindsight, one might say, well, you should have done this, you should have done this, you should have done this. It's, I think, given what we all see in the news and just our own personal lives, that's an unfair thing to expect, that somebody would be able to anticipate what has happened, especially in the healthcare setting. It's just, you can do the best you can, and that's what we try to talk to people about. But it's to your point, it's going to be, I think, unfair to expect that somebody would have anticipated this in the healthcare setting. And I think jurors are going to appreciate that. But at some point that might end, right? We get on 3, 4 months, 6 months, 8 months, when this is over, hopefully, if it's over, do jurors start to kind of forget what they feel now?
Well, you and I have talked about this before. So probably when we're starting out, and we won't exactly go how kind of early on that was, but there was sort of this, I call it the Marcus Welby effect. And there's maybe some people who won't get this reference of Marcus Welby, but there was this old TV show about this great doctor. And when I would talk to jurors about medical malpractice cases, a lot of times I would hear, this sort of, they gave deference to doctors. And it was almost what I called the Marcus Welby effect, because it was sort of the doctors, not that they could do no wrong, but their motive was very strong and good, that they were there to help the patients. Then it's kind of like over the years, I saw that diminish a little bit in my research, in my practice. But now, with what we're dealing with, it seems like there's definitely going to be a little bit more of the Marcus Welby potentially coming back, because they are right now our first line of defense. They are doing so much to help us all sustain and come back to a normal life. I mean, how do you perceive that?
Yeah, I agree completely. I laugh about the Marcus Welby thing.
I know,
yeah,
you and I may have to say Grey's Anatomy soon, but it's that type of look. Right.
So I agree with you. And it got to the point, when getting away from the Marcus Welby thing, where I think all of us we expect perfection from our healthcare providers. And in this setting, it's impossible to expect perfection. So I do think it's kind of come back the other way in the last few months. And there's an article I saw recently with 2 plaintiffs' lawyers out of Houston who have been doing this quite a long time in the long-term care setting. They are concerned about that. They're concerned about, I'm not sure I even want to file these lawsuits, because the juror perception of healthcare providers now is, they're up here in terms of society, and so will that end anytime soon, or for the next 20 years, if we say COVID and healthcare provider in the same sentence, does that evoke memories of that? I think I think we may see that. I hope, because these people have been working their tail ends off.
Absolutely. So has there been something about, since you've been doing this, and this, unlike some, like corporate law, breach of contract law, you're dealing with more human nature type issues with healthcare law. It's somebody coming in, talking to a doctor, somebody going into a facility, an assisted living center. Is there something that you've learned in your practice about human nature when it comes to this?
One thing I've learned is kind of what I just talked about, is that we've come to expect perfection from our providers, it's human nature, I think, to think you are more schooled in this than I am, and therefore you should fix all my problems.
Right.
And it doesn't really always work that way.
Right.
So, I think our nature has kind of become that we expect perfection from our providers. Another thing I've learned in terms of jurors in particular is, I think people generally want to do the right thing in life, and that carries over to being a juror. I think juries really want to try to do the right thing, and I think they do the right thing most of the time. And that's why our system is so great, honestly. We may not like the outcome sometimes, but it may be the right outcome, or at least in terms of those jurors, it was what they believed was the right outcome. And so I think people generally do think or do want to do right. And it took me a long time to appreciate that, but if you go into a jury trial appreciating that, I think it helps.
Absolutely, because they do. They want to, they take it seriously, and they do try to go through the law and figure out, okay, because at the end of the day, it's up to them. They got to sign the verdict form. So they do kind of give their 100% in listening.
Sure.
But that's a great point about perfection. So it's sort of the Marcus Welby effect in a different way.
Right.
They may project too much knowledge on the doctor when the doctor is just trying, this is their specialty, this is what they know, that type of thing.
Right.
Did you ever learn anything from your dad being a plaintiff lawyer in this area, that you've utilized for your practice defending?
I probably shouldn't take many of his lessons. He's
I won't tell him, especially since Father's
he's
Day's
not a very patient or calm person. But that's a great question. What I've learned from him, honestly, to recognize there are two sides to every story. He's good about when I call him now and talk to him about a case.
Yeah.
About saying, but have you seen this? Or when he's talking about his own case, he'll talk about the problems he has in his case and how he's going to overcome those, or going to try to overcome those.
Right.
And that's, don't fall in love with your case is probably one thing I've learned from him. There's always two sides.
Right.
And appreciate the audience when you're doing that. Hit your weaknesses head on.
Right.
Talk about both sides.
And that, I think, is something that we as lawyers sometimes, when we've been practicing in one area too long, is that we get so close to our narrative that we forget that people could look at this from such a different side.
Right.
That I love that that's sort of your lesson, is that always know two sides.
Right.
And kind of keep that first and foremost, because I think it'll make you a better defender.
It does. It also makes you, I think, a better resource for your client, a better, advisor, because you're able to tell them, look, we do have a lot of strengths, but here are some of the weaknesses, and you can't just ignore those. You can't, buy your own bowl, fall in love with your lawsuit.
Right. Or the infamous, you ask your client, so what's the weaknesses of the case? And you hear, blah, 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 blah,
exactly.
Ferris Bueller moment.
Right.
Then you've got kind of like a tougher road.
Yes, no doubt.
So we were talking about this earlier because virtual trials, I know that you have been doing a lot of like depositions and mediations kind of virtually and all of that stuff, more mediations than depositions. What is your stance on, what if we start doing trials virtually? What do you think?
So I'm not a fan of the idea at all. Mediations have been actually, I think, have been great. I've talked to a lot of clients, but I think that may be the future in mediations.
Really?
Yeah, just not having to have clients fly from all over the country to sit in the same room with you.
Right.
The idea is to meet the opposing side and say hello and talk a little bit.
Right.
You can it's been very successful by Zoom, and I think it's been more efficient actually, but the process.
Right.
But you asked about jury trials in particular. For me, part of it is connecting with the jury in terms of being able to read the room, and I think a lawyer's skill set is part of their skill set is having an emotional quotient to where you can read people and read situations and read the judge and opposing counsel, and you lose that if you're not able to visualize that all in one field, I think. And I think that will really impact the outcome of a jury trial. From a juror's perspective, is sitting on the other end of a screen. Right. It's almost like monotonous. They just, they're not appreciating the dynamic either of what's going on in the courtroom, and the lawyers talking to each other, and it's just you lose a lot of that, and that all goes into really what they perceive and the body language of the witnesses, and that I think that helps the jurors to make decisions. And the point you brought up I think is a great one. Earlier when we were talking about the lack of the lack of attention to detail. If you're sitting on the other end of a screen, are you really paying attention? Right. Or as you said, are you spacing out? Are you doing a crossword puzzle on the side, or trying to take care of your child?
Dog bark.
Right.
Exactly.
It's hard to manage that. Judges do a very good job of maintaining the decorum in their courtrooms and making sure people are paying attention. And I think they will lose the ability to do that to a certain extent if they are remote.
Well, and that's what I think too. I mean, there's something to be said that for mediation, great for Zoom because it's expense, it's cost effective. I think that you could get a lot of good out of it. But when we're talking about trials, we're talking about a different animal, and there is something about sitting there as a jury. Your attention is not on anything else but what's happening in the trial. Right. You feel the formality of it, of being sitting there and listening. And I agree with you. You as the lawyers can start taking the pulse of a room just by, okay, did that fact land on them? Are we understanding this issue? It's an art form that I think if we now make this virtual, I'm not so sure it's going to help lawyers or jurors in sort of the art of advocacy to coming to something justice-wise.
Yeah, I agree. And that's just from a juror perspective. I mean, from a witness perspective, I don't like it either. I don't know who's in the room with the juror, with the witness, with an expert, or with a family member, or vice versa. They won't know who's in the room with our defendants, care providers or what have you. So I'm trying not to be the old fogey who just says I'm going to resist change just because I'm going to resist change. I know. I remember I never wanted to use dragon speak and speak either, but now I voice text all the time. So there's probably baby steps maybe, but just jumping in with both feet, I think is. I think it's a recipe for disaster. And I know we were talking earlier. There's one locally that's going to be a non-jury trial, and so it's non-binding. I mean, it's a jury trial, but non-binding. I thought, I applaud the judge for trying to move things forward, and I just don't. If it's non-binding, I mean, I guess it's just an exercise. I don't know. Why do it? You're spending your client's money and dragging this poor plaintiff into a jury trial for a particular period of time. So
So is there you've done a lot of juries, done a lot of trials, all that good stuff. Was there some, like every lawyer has, it's like the My Cousin Vinny moment where you've had like a big win and you walk out of it and you're like, this is kind of something that I've learned from this trial, just like you can learn from a loss. Right. Is there something from a big favorable outcome or win for you that you were like, I wish I would have known this a little bit earlier? Yeah. I know you wanted to talk about some of those types of things. I mean, honestly, I might switch it up on you a little bit because actually my favorite jury trial ever in hindsight, it actually ended up in a hung jury. It wasn't a win. Okay. It was a hung jury. It was a 9-3. The case ended up resolving after the fact before we tried it again. Right. But it involved we defended an OBGYN, and there was a cute little girl. She had it's called a brachial plexus injury. She was, it was right in here, and she,
she was caught in the womb. They couldn't get her out, so they had to do a maneuver.
Right.
They'd do a couple different maneuvers they can try. They tried to do one without injuring her. Unfortunately, it broke, and so she had a kind of an arm that just wasn't as useful. So that defendant I represented is still, it was one of those where you are proud to represent somebody, whether it's plaintiff, defendant, whatever, just a salt of the earth guy. I truly believe he did everything right. I believe that he tried to do everything right. I believe he did ultimately what's in the best interest of the child, because if you don't get the baby out, the outcome is even worse.
Right.
And so, and he was steadfast in his belief, and we tried that for about a week and a half or so. And fast forward, that was, holy moly, that was 2001 maybe, 2001. And 2004, he was the OBGYN for our kids.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
Wow.
So all three of our kids, he delivered all three of them. So kind of came full circle, and it was great. It was great. Yeah.
And it obviously shows the trust and belief that you had.
Yeah,
right.
I did. To the point, this is a guy I represented who was sued for malpractice, but I believe he did right. And, and the family was great. The plaintiff's family, they couldn't have been nicer people, and I felt terrible for them. But, it was great.
Wow.
And funny story about that. He took my oldest out of the womb, and he said, "Wow, this kid's got a big head, but his is physically big, unlike his dad's."
Unlike, totally. That's the first thing we say about Frank.
You're holding my child, man. Could you? Yeah.
Exactly. So last question for you. Since you wanted to go to kind of medical school, and I've been talking about Marcus Welby, and there's people going to be like, "Who the heck is Marcus?"
Yeah.
Favorite medical show for you?
ER. Yeah.
It was a very good show.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today on The Jury's Still Out. Thank you so much, Frank, for joining us. And if you want to hear more about Frank or link to his bio, etc., it's going to be down below. And I hope that you like and subscribe to our channel, The Jury's Still Out. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching The Jury's Still Out. To learn more about Mary Griffiths or our guests today, check the description below. Don't forget, we'll be here every other week of the month with more incredible trial stories.